Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between myself and Michael K. Vaughan, where we combine the forces of stately Vaughan Manor and Hyde Cottage to talk about the comic books on which we have wasted our youths and also our second youths. and This is an event that started on Michael's channel. He started it on his own, just going through Marvel's Epic reprint line, their Epic collections, which are really nice. They're full color reprint volumes in paperback, um, and there's a lot of them, and he has them all. And I thought that I liked the look of that, so I horned my way in, and as a result of that, he gets to pick what we talk about. It's not swapped back and forth. He gets to pick, and sometimes our tastes diverge, but not this time. Not this week. This week, in fact, for the very first time, as far as I can remember, we are talking about World's Finest, about the actual World's Finest. Of course, we both started joking about that right away, but forever and ever, there was a comic book called World's Finest. I loved it. It was one of my foundational comic books, where it was just another comic where you could get new adventures of Superman and Batman. And then after a while, the editors at DC Comics realized, well, if it does this well this way, imagine how much better it would do if Batman and Superman teamed up for at least one. You in a typical issue of World's Finest, you would get 3 or 4, sometimes 5 separate stories. What if we team them up for one such story at least? It was almost always uh, Batman and Superman, and also Robin. It was Batman and Robin and Superman, which is a factor that I really like. It's a difficult thing. It's a task that you take on knowingly ahead of time. What do you do if you are the writer of a story and you need to come up with something that's interesting, that involves the most powerful superhero of them all and an ordinary man and an ordinary boy? What adventure could you possibly give them where the superpowered character wouldn't simply do everything? It wouldn't simply save the non-superpowered characters over and over again. Writers rose to the challenge. Then they rose to the challenge quite often. Uh, and those old World's Finest comics were wonderful for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons I like most is that the Batman and Superman and Robin in those stories were all friends. And that changed. The World's Finest went on for a long time, decades, and they were wonderful. The comic went through many, many different eras, some really, really memorable stories, wonderful stuff. And then DC Comics changed. They went through an event called Crisis on Infinite Earths that revamped their continuity just throughout 40 or 50 years of continuity, and wanted to start with a blank slate. There's no way you can do that. You can't do that. In order to successfully do that, you would have to wipe out the continuity in the minds of the people who've been paying your salary for 50 years, and you can't do that. But they did. They tried it anyway, and once the slate was clean, then writers started to wonder, well, would Batman and Superman be friends? How do we know they wouldn't be enemies? Kind of a fruitless thing to be Superman's enemy, I would say, but nevertheless, one writer in particular, the fan favorite writer, John Byrne, did create that kind of an atmosphere where Superman and Batman have a grudging respect for each other, but they aren't friends. They don't know each other's secret identities. They don't like each other. And that approach, it was never done well in DC Comics. That has never been done well in DC Comics. But in the DC animated universe, it has been done well. There is a Batman Superman movie, an animated movie, in which they meet for the first time, and before they are friends, they are enemies, and it's very well done. But typically not in the comics. It doesn't work in the comics because in DC Comics, the heroes are all friends. They're all well-adjusted. They don't have individual personalities. They don't have individual psychological hang-ups. They aren't going to peace rallies. They don't have ban the bomb banners painted on their bellies. They aren't hippies in any way. They're straightforward, ordinary people. They are heroes. And they're all friends and colleagues with each other. And they're all embraced by law enforcement all over the world. It's Marvel Comics where the heroes don't like each other, and the whole point, I would argue, the whole point of Crisis on Infinite Earths and every Crisis, every continuity revamp that's ever happened since then, has been to more and more intensely Marvelize DC Comics. The result that in some later years, and as in the wake of other continuity revamps, Superman and Batman continued to be bristly, I really don't like you enemies, where Batman is constantly plotting to kill Superman. He's weaponizing kryptonite in his own private lab. He's coming up with all sorts of doomsday scenarios where he can take out Superman, and Superman knows it. How you would ever work on the same team with someone if you knew that. Uh, there have been good moments. There have been some good moments. I have almost all of them in long boxes right here at Hyde Cottage, but usually it has not worked because the premise is flawed. Because if you're going from a Crisis on Infinite Earths and all the aftermath premise where Superman and Batman don't like each other, or where Superman and Wonder Woman may have been a romantic interest at one time or something like that, or whereas Wonder Woman and Batman may have been a romantic interest, we're going on stuff like that, you're not going to be able typically to produce good stuff. And that makes what we're talking about today all the more amazing because it is a complete success. It is an example where Michael K. Vaughan and I are agreeing completely, and it's also a complete success. And it's what I'm going to talk about now, but I'm going to finish up this video. I want to warn you ahead of time. I'm going to finish up this video with a rant. It doesn't have anything to do with the comic that we're talking about today. It doesn't have, I'm not ranting against Michael K. Vaughan. He has picked a wonderful choice this week. I just felt like the rant should go in a comic book video as opposed to in a mail haul or something like that. So just so you know, there'll be two different subjects, and I'll warn you so that you don't need to bother with the rant. I just have to get it off my chest. But the thing that we're doing is this: World's Finest, The Devil Neza. This is drawn by Dan Mora and written by Mark Waid, who is a comic book legend. He is responsible for some of the greatest and most reprinted comic book stories of the modern era. He's an insufferable twat as well, is personally an insufferable twat. And I have always had a good deal of wariness about him because of that. Because I know that he is. He was affected really hard by the SJW virus that affected Marvel Comics and DC Comics about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. He was affected really hard by that and started injecting a lot of idiotic virtue signaling Twitter politics into his comic books. And I won't even say not caring whether or not his readers liked that, but actually caring that they don't like it, hoping that they don't like it. I'd like to think that that fever has largely crested in the comic book world, especially since it had the one and only predictable effect that it ever could have, which was to crater the comic book industry, and it did. There are no readers for these things anymore. The World's Finest, Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, the X-Men are lucky if they sell 2,000 or 3,000 issues a month. You'll have a hard time finding figures like that because the reporting is done from the number of issues that are shipped rather to comic shops rather than the number of issues that sell. But if you dig around, and especially if you talk to comic shop owners or listen to them talk amongst themselves, you realize that the numbers are infinitesimally small. So, and that wasn't true even after a Great Recession. That wasn't true until the creators of Marvel and then DC Comics started actively working to drive away their fans, the people who could be counted on to carry them through lean times. They did that, and they were never reprimanded by their editors. They were never stopped from doing that. As far as I know, they still do it, which meant that Marvel Comics and then DC Comics were all but unreadable. They were, well, they were everything that the SJW creators of those comics dreamed that they weren't. They were intensely racist, intensely sexist. They were very bad storytelling, usually horrible artwork. They were totally not in character. None of the characters were in character. And they were characterized by a process known as fan baiting, which came into vogue in the last 10 years, and companies ought to have known better than to indulge in it. And that is where you sit down at your conceptual table. So long before there are any specific writer, artist, writer, story sessions, but in the conception, in conceiving a storyline, you sit down or you video conference, and your organizing question is not what is our next story going to be for the Justice League or the Teen Titans or whatever, but instead your organizing question is, we know the core group of our fans, what will antagonize them the most, not the least. What will they hate the most? That's fan baiting. That's what we want to do. Whatever will make them hate it the most. And that blighted first Marvel Comics, where for 3 or 4 years, if you wanted to buy a Marvel comic in a comic shop, you weren't going to get anything recognizable. You were going to get a teenage girl as Iron Man. You were going to get a teenage Asian boy as the Hulk. You were going to get either a fat, bloated, multiple amputee, alcoholic Thor, or you were getting a woman as Thor. You were going to get all sorts of. You were going to get someone who was mentally retarded in leading a comic book. You were going to get a female superhero who is fighting crime while 9 months pregnant. You were going to get things that were designed to repulse you as a longtime comic book reader. You're also going to have continuity revamped, left, right, and center. You're going to get that elsewhere as well in the Terminator movies, where John Connor gets a bullet in the head, or you are going to get it in TV, where Doctor Who was not William Hartnell. This is that everything that you've known for 50 years about this character is wrong, because we need to elevate Twitter politics. You're going to get it on cable streaming services with Amazon's The Rings of Power, and you get it in the comic books as well, so that they become unrecognizable and repulsive to longtime readers. Because not repulsive because those things are inherently repulsive, but repulsive because they were created to repulse you. That was part of the whole process. That is fan baiting. So when I heard that Mark Waid was going to write a World's Finest comic, I applauded the return of the traditional title, World's Finest. For a long time, for 6 or 7 years, Batman and Superman had a long run of a team-up comic. DC Comics knows that is a fan favorite thing. They just didn't call it World's Finest. Instead, they called it Batman Superman. And I don't know if the editorial meeting records are preserved, but I would bet you a Boston cream pie that I know why that was called World's Finest. That was called Batman Superman instead of World's Finest. I bet I know why that was. And I bet it was a political reason. When comic books, despite what you have heard from anyone who prognosticates on this subject, who has pronouns in their bio on Twitter, comic books are not political. Or they may be political, but they're not partisan. And around 2013, 2014, but especially after 2015, 2016, I wonder why they became intensely partisan. It's not that there's good and bad in the world. It's that there are good and bad comic book readers, and we're going to tell you which one you are. No one wants that in their comic books. No one does, no matter what side you happen to be on, no matter whether you're a quote unquote ally or not. And it drove away legions of fans who will never come back. They've gone to manga or elsewhere and just dropped the whole habit, or they've gone to back issues, which is why reprints in Marvel and DC do so well. So when I heard, long story short, when I heard that believe it or not, this is not the rant part of the video. When I heard that Mark Waid was going to do a World's Finest, I expected the worst. Absolutely the worst. I expected that Batman would be a misogynistic renegade, and that Superman would be a dumb icon of all cops are bastards. I expected that it would be all of the Twitter posturing that Mark Waid used to do until his bosses sat down on him and said, if you keep losing us money, giant in the industry or not, we're going to cut ties with you and never resume them. It was for DC Comics that Mark Waid wrote one of the greatest comic books of all time. So I feared the worst. And then I read the first issue, and then I read the second issue, and then I read the third issue. This has the first 5 issues, I think, this graphic novel. And they're great. They're just great. These are just fantastic comic book stories. They're every bit as intelligent and quippy and Joss Whedon style snarky humor as all other modern comics are, but they are completely missing any of the grandstanding or the fan baiting that have characterized this writer's work and lots of other work in both superhero companies for the last almost 10 years. It's completely missing those elements. It's instead just fantastic, smart, wonderful, the artwork's incredible, comic book storytelling. And when I read those first 2 or 3 issues, I read the first issue and loved it. I thought, okay, well, that's a fluke. That's the reason that I loved it was carefully designed at those editorial meetings where scorn was heaped on me so personally as almost to be by name. We're gonna give them, the fans that we hate, the longtime fans of comic books, we're gonna give them an issue that is just the sort of whiz bang kapow stuff they love. And then once we've got the out of the gate sale numbers, then we'll be free to do what we want. And what we want is to subvert expectations and make this a dystopian nightmare where the female characters are the only people who have any morals, any competence, any physical ability, any intelligence of any kind in any way, and routinely make short work of any male villains. The one punch scenario that was just full. It filled Marvel Comics, where your female characters cannot go through any kind of trial. They cannot be tested by experience or beaten by villains. No, no, they're beaten by the complexity of the deli menu, because there are four or five pages devoted to ordering, eating, and talking about food in every one of those issues. They're defeated by that menu because, is this ethically sourced? And there's so many things to choose from. I don't know. But they aren't defeated by the villains. No, the villains are just dumb. And I was expecting that. I was expecting that after the stellar first issue here, that this would descend into basically Twitter politics, into SJW posturing. Look at this great cover. You can't really make out the details here in this crappy lighting, but this is one half Superman and one half Batman for all the icons of their mythology. Just wonderful. Just wonderful stuff. And I kept expecting it, and every issue was just great. The second shoe never fell. I was lured in. I am a faithful reader of this comic, but I have not yet been betrayed. And this is just the first few months of this comic. It's gone on since then. It's still terrific. Absolutely terrific. I can't help but think it probably sells well too for DC, although again, they actively try to hide the numbers, so there's no real way to know for sure. Either way, I took the precaution of asking my comic book guy at my comic book shop to hold issues of these things just in case they do go, because they are good. And it's one of the only issues, one of the only ongoing monthly comics in Marvel or DC that actually is good. So, this particular storyline tells the story of a villain called the Devil Mesa, who is got amorphous mystical powers, and mystical powers mean that he's effective against Superman, who's vulnerable to magic like anybody else. And he's also time straddling. So there's a cult, and there are appearances of Devil Mesa throughout time, which leads to a whole bunch of very old-fashioned comic book writing on Mark Waid's part. Keep in mind, he didn't grow up with that insane Twitter posturing. He didn't grow up with that. He grew up with the same comics I did. And it brings back a lot of that stuff in these comics. First of all, the heroes are friends. Batman and Superman are friends who respect each other's abilities. Also, Mark Waid made the decision to bring in a secondary cast of superheroes, which is a little bit rare in comic books these days, for an ongoing thing. Not only does he give you Robin as Batman's sidekick, but he also gives you Supergirl as a kind of sidekick of Superman. She never actually was, but they're ongoing characters. Robin and Supergirl are ongoing characters in this comic. We saw a much later issue of this on one of my videos a couple of weeks ago, where Robin and Supergirl go on a date that ends disastrously. And that would end a lot more disastrously if this were happening in modern DC continuity, where there are no straight characters. Mark Waid just ignores that. That's what he does in this comic, just throughout. He writes really well, but the main thing he's doing in these issues is just ignoring things. So there's 25 years of botched continuity where Batman and Superman hate each other. I'm just going to ignore that. There's all sorts of new continuity where Superman's father survives the destruction of Krypton, where Martha Kent is a smart suit wearing take no prisoners girl boss, where Supergirl and Robin are both gay. I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to ignore all of that. I'm just going to tell plain old comic book stories in really lively, funny, entertaining ways. And it works. It absolutely works. I'm not 100% sure that the reason, I mean, this works, and I'm sure that Michael K. Vaughan loved it for that. I'm not 100% sure that the reason they didn't pick this particular graphic novel is because the Doom Patrol makes a persistent appearance. We've already talked about the Doom Patrol, the loser superhero team, on this weekly exchange a couple of times. And they make an appearance in this graphic novel. They are no more interesting or effective than they ever are in any of their appearances, but nevertheless, Mark Waid makes them bearable, as he has done before. He did it in a revival of The Brave and the Bold. He also made the Doom Patrol. He clearly has an affectionate spot in his heart for them, unaccountably, as some comic book fans do. Uh, but this is terrific. This is terrific stuff. I hope that this World's Finest continues this way forever. I still have my hackles up. I still wonder if maybe it's an elaborate trap. This has been going on for a couple of years. I doubt that there's any kind of foreplanning like that. So I have to think instead that this comic arose through fiat, through a declaration, a specific declaration that was said or even written. I have to believe that this arises from that. I just wish I knew the details. I wish I knew whether or not I was right about that. I have to believe that either DC Comics went to Mark Waid and said, "We want you to write a Superman Batman title. And come on, you're not getting any younger. You may not get an offer like this again." But it has to be old fashioned. It cannot have even the slightest hint of Twitter posturing, not the slightest hint of it. Or Mark Waid went to DC and said, "I want to write a Superman Batman team up, but I want it to be completely classical. I'm going to basically ignore the continuity revamps that have been done forever." Notice Batman has a yellow circle around his bat signal. That ought to tell you something. Superman has a spit curl and his normal suite of powers. In this storyline, those powers are amped up, but only for this storyline. Did Mark Waid go to DC and say, "I'm just going to ignore all the stuff that I've been doing in comics and that I've been championing other people doing in comics? I'm going to ignore all of that and just tell a completely normal comic book story. No strings attached, no irony, no mockery of fans behind my hand, nothing like that." I don't know the story. I don't know whether they went to him or he went to them, but I firmly believe that this thing came about by fiat, that it came about by a declaration, that is not going to happen in this comic. And the reason why I say that is because it's absolutely conspicuous. Though that kind of Twitter posturing is still the rule rather than the exception in superhero comics. So to find a comic that not only is well done, but that is completely missing that, I can't help but think that's not an accident. So, so this is either way. Well, however it happened, whether it's just happenstance or whether Mark Waid got tired of what was obviously fake posturing on his part, the result is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I cannot recommend this particular World's Finest strong enough. And that is the normal Epic Comic Book Wednesday section of this video. Now I'm going to indulge in a rant that comes from the strangest of all places, the Times Literary Supplement, the latest TLS, the letters column specifically, because the TLS just recently did a review of Marvel Comics 3 appearances in the Penguin Classic line. We saw them on this channel. The Penguin Classic Black Spine Paperback Classic line had 3 Marvel Comics creations: Spider-Man, Captain America, and the Black Panther. And the TLS, much to my delight, did a whole review of those first 3. It was wonderful stuff. And they got a letter. And I want to read you the letter and then rant just a bit, if you'll indulge me. In his review of the 3 recent collections of Marvel Comics from Penguin Random House, J.S. Barnes describes Stan Lee as, quote, "the presiding genius behind Marvel Comics," and proceeds from that outsized absurdity to the slightly more nuanced but more offensive historical falsehood of attributing all the commercial and aesthetic virtue of the comic stories that rightly belong to the 2 artists who conceived, plotted, drew, told, and essentially wrote the first draft of the stories to Stan Lee. I should have known at this point in the letter who wrote it, but I just kept blithely on. That is unbelievable, wild inaccuracy, but we'll just keep going. These 2 artists were Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. Jack Kirby, the famous co-creator of Captain America, the artist behind the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Avengers at first, and Steve Ditko, the artist behind Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. It was Kirby, not Lee, who was the driving creative force behind those titles that Barnes enumerates as part of Lee's astonishingly fecund run of creativity: Captain America, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, the X-Men, and unmentioned Thor. Likewise, Ditko was the driving creative force behind Spider-Man and, after he took it over from Kirby, the Hulk, as well as Doctor Strange. It is by now well known that Kirby and Ditko conceived most of the stories, created most of the characters. In Kirby's case, Galactus, the Silver Surfer, the Inhumans, Doctor Doom, and dozens more. In Ditko's case, most, if not all, of Spider-Man villains everyone sees on the screen today, as well as many of the supporting characters and who drew the stories. No one's contesting that Stan Lee drew the stories. Describing Spider-Man's creation, Barnes writes of, quote, Steve Ditko's angular, detailed artwork providing the ideal counterpoint to the swagger and brio of Lee's scripts, close quote. In fact, there were no scripts. The closest thing to a script was Kirby and Ditko's notes in the outside margins of the original art, telling Lee what was happening and approximating dialogue from which information Lee filled in the dialogue balloons, which was the closest Lee ever got to writing. Again, I should have known at this point who was writing this letter. That is absolute slander. Ditko's angular, detailed artwork wasn't the counterpoint, it was the point. This understanding of Marvel's early creative process is now almost unanimously accepted among historians and scholars. See the Kirby biography, Tales to Astonish, by Ronin Rowe, the Lee biography, True Believer, by Abraham Reisman, and the Ditko biography, Strange and Stranger, The World of Steve Ditko, by Blake Bell. Barnes refers to Lee correctly as, quote, a hucksterish showman. All the more surprising that he would recycle his self-mythologizing duplicities. Stan Lee's contributions weren't nothing. Thanks. That's great. His jaunty, jocular dialogue and overwrought melodrama added something new to mainstream comics. But if there were any geniuses involved in the creation of early Marvel, they were Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. And the author of that letter is Gary Groth, the genius behind the Comics Journal. And it is completely false. And I don't know how long we as comic book readers, aficionados, even readers of comic book history, are going to have to endure this kind of thing from Gary Groth. I guess he's just going to take this story to his grave. The two of the biographies that he cites as sources for this, first of all, they don't have any sources of their own. And naturally, they are putting forth partisan views of the creative process at Marvel Comics, because if they didn't do that, if they didn't champion the outsized claims of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, they wouldn't have had access to the people who had primary source stories and anecdotes to fill their book. I have no idea what Reisman's problem was with Stan Lee, but then again, I've never known what Gary Groth's problem with Stan Lee is either. And I don't think the fact that Gary Groth had a dicey relationship with his father should really stand as a reason why this character assassination of Stan Lee should just continue decade after decade after decade. That is the claim that filling in word balloons was as close as Stan Lee ever got to writing is absurd. Maybe you could make a case that there were no scripts. That's true. That was not the Marvel method of production. It was that Stan Lee would talk to or phone up the people he was collaborating with, whoever it was, and they would talk out the story that Stan Lee had invented. Stan Lee invented Galactus. Stan Lee invented these villains. He invented these storylines. Here's what's going to happen. The X-Men are going to have this adventure. The Avengers are going to have this adventure. And I'm thinking of something wild. I'm thinking of a whole bunch of wild things, like maybe they don't get along with each other. Like maybe one of their members is wounded in battle, has to go to the hospital, especially Thor. Gigantic storylines that Jack Kirby could not have created if you'd filled him to his eyeballs with mescaline. It would not have happened. Granted, there were no scripts. Stan Lee didn't write out scripts and send them to Lee and Ditko and Kirby and Ditko or anybody else. Instead, there were story conferences. And in a couple of points in the past, Gary Groth has said, well, a story conference, that's what an editor does. That's not what a writer does. No, that's what an editor does now. No one was keeping meticulous historical archival notes of Marvel Comics at the time. Comic books weren't considered all that important at the time. No one knew how successful Marvel Comics would be. And even when the sales figures for the first issue of the Fantastic Four came in, still no one thought, well, we should have someone videotaping these story conferences. That's why there's no primary evidence. Not because it doesn't exist, not because it didn't happen. Stan Lee thought up these things, sometimes in broad strokes, but often in great detail. And you can tell that from the marginal artist notes in the page proofs that Groth is referencing. The very things he's referencing show the opposite of what he's saying. The fact that he's lying about this and has been lying about this for decades. I don't know what his problem is with Stan Lee, but his narrative has taken hold. There are a lot of people who firmly believe Stan Lee had nothing to do with Marvel Comics, or that insultingly, as this letter grants him, maybe he filled in a few word balloons, but otherwise he had nothing to do with it. That's absurd, absolutely absurd. And the artist notes on the page proofs that Groth is citing prove that. It's just because he is presenting a skewed view, he has to present cherry-picked evidence for that view, and that's what he does. Those notes and plenty of contemporaneous or relatively contemporaneous late 60s interviews with artists, including Lee and Kirby and Ditko, but plenty of other artists too. Plenty of those early interviews described the process as it actually happened, that Stan Lee had most of the ideas. Here's what I want to happen. The reason that that Ditko and Kirby had to leave notes along the margins of the artwork is the same reason that artists do today. Are people saying today that the artists are writing the comics that have writers' names attached to them? No, they aren't. And they didn't say it then either. It's just this anti-Stan Lee thing that has cropped up since Stan Lee's success as a Marvel impresario. This wasn't being said anywhere other than the Comics Journal and whatever fanzine Gary Groth was writing for before the Comics Journal, until success happened and made Stan Lee, a primary target for this kind of crap. But those artist notes are also asking questions. Well, if Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were busy writing every single last detail of the X-Men and the Avengers and Doctor Strange and the Hulk and the Fantastic Four and Thor, why would they ask questions? Why would they ask questions of the stooge that's only filling in the word bubbles? No, the artist notes alone prove the case against Gary Groth. But in addition to that, there's an ample evidence. It's oral evidence because no one thought to preserve this stuff. No one thought to tape story conferences with Stan Lee. How I'd love to hear those story conferences, but nevertheless, they happened, and contemporaneous interviews, or relatively contemporaneous interviews, prove that they happen. Refer to them often. No one was saying this back when it was happening. So we have that. But we also have another it's not direct evidence, but it's as close as you can get, which is that once their fame took off, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, some publishers were foolish enough to give them writing credits, to give them exactly the thing they didn't have with any of these foundational Marvel comics that they're posthumously being claimed now. In other words, they were allowed to write their own comics. We have extensive examples in both cases of what their own comics would be like if they wrote them. To put it mildly, if you think that Steve Ditko's The Changing Man, or anything written by Jack Kirby, has anything like the mythic resonance of those Marvel comics that you yourself revere, if you think that you're seeing that in the writings that actually are attributable to Kirby and Ditko, then I've got some beachfront property in Arizona that I'm willing to let you go. I'm going to let you have it really cheap. The proof is in the pudding. We know what these guys were like when they wrote their own books. It's nothing like Marvel Comics. For Gary Groth to claim decade after decade that the intricacies, and that's what they are, of Peter Parker's tortured love life during the great era where John Romita Sr. was doing the artwork, the intricacies of the Don Heck era of the Avengers, where the team became extremely underpowered and had to claw its way back to power and respectability. The dialogue involved there is not just word balloons. The plots involved there are not just things that an artist can move around on a board. They were created by a writer. I'll never understand where this nonsense comes from, but it persists. Here it is in the letters column of the TLS. I'm going to hope. I'm a little tired myself of jousting with Gary Groth in print. So I'm going to hope that someone else takes up the cause in response to that absurd letter in the next issue of the TLS. I bet they don't. I bet not many comic book readers read the TLS. I'm sure that Gary Groth doesn't. I'm sure that this came to his attention probably only because he has maybe a Google search for Stan Lee so that he can bash this whack-a-mole whenever it pops up. Make sure nobody ever reveres Stan Lee for the things that he demonstrably did. But I had to make some response. I figure my imaginary booktube friends is a perfect venue, especially the 2 or 3 of you who watch these comic book videos. Because that is maddening. That is absolutely maddening. saying Stan Lee filled in word balloons and did nothing else. He didn't do any plotting, didn't do any character creation, nothing at all. It was all these artists of his. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It's disproven by the facts. It's disproven by the oral history, and it's disproven by comparing what those artists did when they did write their own books. It'd be nice. Like I said, I have no idea what Gary Groth's problem is. I have no idea what Reisman's problem is in his villainous Stan Lee biography, and I'm hoping that the historical record writes itself, so that we don't have to keep doing this over and over again. But anyway, that is your Epic Comic Book Wednesday video in two parts. One is about a comic book, and one is a rant about a comic book subject. I will not be doing this again, so we'll see what Michael comes up with next week, and it'll just be that. It won't be another rant. So I will wrap this up for now. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.